Good morning. Thanks everyone for being here to reconvene the January Parks and Wildlife Commission meeting. We are going to first catch up on the couple of items we didn't get to yesterday. Also, before we do that, there's two things on your desks or in your space I wanted to point out. This calendar that everyone has on their desk, you're like, oh, I wonder what that is. And then you open it, it is so impressive. I mean, these are elementary kids' artwork, and it is so cool, and little quote from the kid about what they were thinking about when they drew it. I just thought it was really cool. And it's a Parks and Wildlife and GoCo, this project Soul, which is schools and outdoor learning environments. And it just fits with our theme of yesterday at lunch and the forum we're going to do in March, just what we're doing to connect kids and families to the outdoors, and how CPW has such a big role in that effort. Everything we're already doing and what more we could do. So if you haven't checked it out, it's pretty cool. The other thing that's on your desk is a printout called Predator and Elk Research Update. There's extra copies of this in the back. This is going to take the place of item number 27, the research overview. And the reason we're doing that was of course to make up some time today. As many of you know, with us being back in session, we have the Claw Caucus, the Sportsman Caucus. We have a number of things down at the Capitol that I know people want to participate in. So I'm hoping to get us finished up for certain on time, and hopefully a little bit early, so people can make those commitments they may have down at the Capitol. But this, the Predator and Elk Research Update, you can read at your leisure. It's also, like I say, it's also on the back. One thing to keep in mind, any of this ongoing research, and I might need Dan or Jeff to help me say it right, but anytime we have ongoing research, which we always have ongoing research in the agency, we don't want to talk about the findings and exactly all the details of what we're studying, what we're finding in the moment of the research. I think that's just best practice, and it may even be a legal thing. I'm looking at Jake. So with regard to additional detailed questions about some of this stuff, we may not be able to know at this time. It's probably something we wouldn't know until the report comes out. So is that generally the right way to say that?
Yes, and there's a concern under CORA. So under CORA, the commission is entitled to keep private ongoing research projects, and by sort of opening the door and providing some information, you're vulnerable to an argument that the door has been flung wide open, and you're no longer entitled to rely on that privilege to maintain the confidentiality of the details of the project.
Okay. So, Commissioner Garcia.
No, I was just, Mr. Matter, I couldn't hear very well. I thought maybe his mic wasn't, so I was adjusting.
Okay. That's a good reminder to speak into your microphone, please. So thank you, and that's just a little, as you're reading the research update, that would be just good to keep in the back of your mind. All right, that's all I have for updates and stuff before we get started. Emily Urbanic from GoCo, agenda item 22 from yesterday. Welcome, and thank you for being flexible and joining us again today.
Of course. Thank you, Madam Chair, Commissioners, Director. Happy New Year. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm going to share updates around three really exciting efforts that are happening in our collective universes. First, I wanted to start with a strategic plan update. Many of you have seen this slide, especially staff in the audience. In 2015, GoCo rolled out Protect, Connect, and Inspire. And CPW has been pivotal to the success of that plan, especially our work through Generation Wild. But GoCo missed an opportunity to really thoughtfully engage our biggest and most important partner in that strategic planning effort. And since then, both GoCo and CPW have grown and evolved. We have a much stronger relationship built on trust and partnership than we did 5 years ago. And at the onset of this planning process, which has been roughly a year now, our planning consultants interviewed nearly 100 stakeholders, community leaders, and partners across the state, and that list included folks that aren't GOCO's biggest supporters, as well as people who have engaged with us for years. Many CPW voices, including people around this table and in this room, were interviewed in that process. And from those initial conversations, plus significant learnings from guiding documents like the SCORP, CPW's strategic plan, and others, plus a summer's worth of strategic planning committees, the GOCO board is working with this draft strategic direction statement right now, which says GOCO elevates collaborative, impactful projects, values equity, and evolves programs to sustain Colorado's great outdoors. And those 3 ideas that are embedded in there each have a GOCO team of about 5 to 6 staffers who have been doing significant research, analysis, and interviews over the last 4 to 5 months to really build out those ideas. And that's what Chris and I talked with you all about in November. We have a slate of draft program values also that we are considering as we build programs back into our portfolio. But what's particularly different about this planning process is our engagement with CPW. And in addition to this list, we had, for the first time ever this week, a 3-hour facilitated conversation with a cross-section of the agency. And I think if I told Regional Manager Romansky about a month ago when I invited him to this that he was going to have to fill out several sticky notes in small group discussions, he probably would have told me to take a hike. But we had a great conversation. GOCO learned a lot from that exercise. I'm really thankful to Director Prenslow for his support of that, Commissioner Garcia's involvement in that conversation. And it gave us some amazing ideas to consider moving forward. And most importantly, some really important challenges and hurdles that CPW faces that GOCO doesn't automatically think about. So we're excited to continue this conversation with the agency over the next several months to really make sure that CPW's priorities are embedded into this plan. So next on deck for us in terms of strategic planning, we have a 14-stop statewide tour. We start next week in Steamboat and we'll be on the road for about the next 6 weeks. So I might be a little winded in March. Any questions on strategic planning before I move on?
If you could just go back to the first slide.
Commissioner Garcia.
The
This one?
second, the direction statement.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you who are detail people, all of those commas and colons, that's Commissioner Haskett. And so if you have
Hauser.
doubts about her use.
Hauser, you don't.
Hauser, I'm sorry.
Haskett's like, I didn't do anything.
Don't blame.
Commissioner Hauser did all of those, and so if you have any questions about her use of those, please talk to her.
They're all very meaningful
Yeah.
and important.
Yes. And they're the correct use of commas.
Emily, I do have a question. Can
Yeah.
you remind us again the timeline for strategic planning? Is it a 10-year plan, or do you do them? Are you?
They're typically a 5-year plan, and we still are on schedule to adopt our plan in June. But that does not mean that our conversations with CPW aren't going to continue. And some of the things that we're thinking about in this strategic plan, we're going to have to work through the next 1 to 2 years to really get programs up and running.
Okay, thanks.
So typically 5 years. Second, it's my pleasure to announce that the Restore Colorado program is live. This idea grew out of the fact that several funders operating in the habitat restoration universe often saw each other's names on the project budget as match. And so we sat down as funders to try and figure out a way to be more thoughtful on the front end in order to have a larger impact on the ground. So this was a co-created funding model between the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, GOCO, and the Gates Family Foundation. CPW and DNR have been at the table and really supportive of the idea from the beginning. And the goal is to fund large-scale habitat restoration projects across several ecosystems in the state. And NIFWIF is the group that is administering this program for all of the funding partners. And anytime NIFWIF rolls out a new RFP, they host a webinar. And our webinar for the Restore Colorado program was earlier this week. And this point of comparison is pretty astounding to me. When NIFWF announced the Migration Corridors opportunity last fall, which was in coordination with the secretarial order, a huge momentum across 11 Western states and state agencies, they had 60 people sign up for that webinar. On Tuesday, during the Restore webinar, we had 217 registered attendees, which is the new single-day record for NIFWF program. So we're really, really excited about the potential for Restore. And also, it would be remiss of me listening to Director Gibbs' comments from yesterday morning. And we're working closely with the folks on the RIMRI initiative and plan to have a joint Rocky Mountain Restoration Initiative and Restore session at the Partners Conference in April to talk about how the efforts complement each other but are ultimately different.
NIFWF, National
Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And they're obviously a national group chartered by Congress, and so we're excited to have them as a partner.
Emily,
Commissioner Garcia.
Yes.
since we met on Monday, I've had at least 3 organizations contact me about the application process. Is there something you could send to us that I could just give to them?
Absolutely. We will make sure that the commission has a link, and I'm glad you brought that up. I meant to say, so the webinar is recorded, and GOCO's website, Gates Family Foundation website, all point to the NIFWF site and the Restore page. But we will make sure that you have that.
Great, thank you.
And finally, the CPW Directors Innovation Fund is live. This is the 4th year of this program. And this grew out of too many hours in trucks with AWM and park managers who had great projects and just needed $5,000, $10,000 to get them across the finish line or to get some momentum behind them. And they'd ask about how they could get money from GOCO. And I would describe the investment proposal process and how our money traditionally works with the agency, and getting $5,000 for an individual project out of that long, cumbersome process is challenging. So working with regional managers, Director Prenzlow, we put some ideas behind what turned out to be the first time that CPW staff could come directly to GOCO for a grant. And we have funded some amazing projects over the last 3 years, training for Cash the Wildlife Canine, some campsite improvements at Jackson Lake State Park that now offer hammock camping, and I think about a dozen sites out there, which is pretty cool. A really compelling restoration project on the Yampa River at Chuck Lewis State Wildlife Area. We seeded the Agents of Discovery app, which I think is in about 10 parks now. And funded some important infrastructure projects. That's a picture of a new ADA compliant bridge at the Rifle Falls Fish Hatchery, which has really spurred new trail building and visitation, and it's an incredible amenity for that facility. So applications are due at the beginning of April. They're open to all CPW staff at all levels, and I'm excited to see what this year brings and to also evolve this program with Director Prenzlow over the next 12 months. That's it for me today. Any questions?
Commissioner Schaefer.
Thank you. I'll just reiterate, I've said before, I'm unbelievably excited about the Restore program. I think like the fact that there was that much interest also makes it even more exciting of the potential that this thing has to really transform wildlife habitat conservation by creating higher value habitat. The restoration aspect is something that hasn't traditionally been funded at a high level, certainly by a consortium of different funders. So this has some great potential to not just sustain our populations, but really be able to provide for some new opportunities that we haven't been able to think about.
Commissioner Hauser.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Emily. Would you, I know it's gone out to us, but would you sort of underscore, or maybe Dan and his team, Laura, can make sure that we all have the dates for the engagement conversations around the state? And I would just encourage everyone, if there's a stop near you, to have a good CPW commissioner presence. A great way to sort of germinate our two organizations, and for us to be up to speed on the strategic planning process and weigh in on that as well. So, thanks.
Absolutely.
Great suggestion. Emily, you had mentioned the movement corridor webinar had 60 people or whatever. Is that still a program? I mean, or was that a one-time program for GOCO?
That was a
grant.
NIFWIF program, the Migration Corridors
Yeah.
program.
Are they doing that again?
I cannot answer that question. No. But I can ask someone at NIFWIF and get back to you.
Okay. I didn't know if GOCO was a part of that or if that was just.
We are not a part of that. We're funding, we have seeded wildlife crossings through CPW through the investment proposal process. But that grant program is an 11-state opportunity to fund migration corridors across
Okay.
the West.
Got it. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. Brett Ackerman, this is agenda item 19 from yesterday, non-wildlife related use of state wildlife areas. And thank you as well for being flexible and moving to this morning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, members of the Commission, Brett Ackerman, Southeast Regional Manager, Parks and Wildlife, and thank you for the opportunity to spend a little time talking with you today. There have been a number of times during this two-day meeting when I've been excited to be a resident of this state. The things that we discuss and the things that we see make me excited, and I'm even more grateful to have an opportunity to participate in the role of management and provision of some of the opportunities that Director Fay's video from yesterday showed in the state. As Director Prenslow mentioned, we're going on 42 state parks in the state, and we have great opportunities to camp and hike and many things in the state. But I wanted to talk to you for a few minutes today about another purposed type of property that we have in state wildlife areas, and talk about some of the challenges that we're facing with regard to management of state wildlife areas. Although I am the Southeast Regional Manager, I'm here on behalf of all of us, as this is a statewide issue. And so after today's discussion, if you have further input, please feel free to call me and Corey or JT or Mark as well. State wildlife areas are properties specifically purchased with hunter and angler dollars. And we have about 300 in the state, about 500,000 acres of state wildlife areas, and you have a commission policy on state wildlife areas that states it is the intent of the commission that in accordance with state law, state wildlife areas be acquired and managed for the preservation and conservation of wildlife and their habitat, and also to provide wildlife-related recreational opportunities to the public, so long as such uses are compatible with wildlife and habitat management goals. When people think of public land, often they think of free access public land. I can go on, I can do whatever I want. But really, there are some types of public land that are intended for specific purposes, and this is one of those types of public lands. So because they're purchased for that purpose, they generally have been open to the public. You know, they've got each wildlife area may have some specific restrictions, and even some regarding access and times and purposes of the state wildlife areas. But generally, the default has been to keep those open to the public, as they've already been paid for by hunters and anglers, and they're intended to be used by those folks. But over time, this open door approach has led to pretty significant use of many of these properties, as they are beautiful, they are great habitat, they do contain wildlife. So pretty significant use of many of these properties for non-wildlife related uses, with many out there being listed on free camping websites. Hey, come here and camp at this place, it's free. Your commission policy also states state wildlife areas are not acquired, designed, or normally managed to provide for non-wildlife oriented recreation. But it does provide an exception. However, some uses are permitted when they're supportive of, incidental to, and compatible with wildlife recreation. And examples of these include camping and picnicking and hiking. The shift in use in many of these properties over the years has led to people coming to these properties for the express purposes of non-wildlife related recreation, to camp and to hike rather than those uses being incidental of wildlife-related recreation. And excuse me. And even many are beginning to be used by kind of nomadic, full-time RV type folks that find a free place to camp and stay there for as long as they can until we run them off. So in order to take a look at this issue, we've commissioned a group of AWMs, one from each region, to get together and to discuss the issues associated with this. And this process, we've given them kind of a charge of taking a look at all access and camping-related regulations that are individual on properties, and taking a look to see if there's a statewide approach. And even more, taking a look to see if there's a way that we can charge for non-wildlife related recreation on state wildlife areas. There are several federal Nexus rules, maybe statutory rules, and so they'll have to take a look at those and look at statutory and policy issues to make sure that we can do that within the bounds of the existing law. But we've asked them to come back and consider a suite of options to help us address this issue. And we've given them until this spring to do so. But we wanted to introduce this issue to the Commission and let you know that although it's a bit of an odd process, we also, if they come back with good recommendations associated with regulations, don't want to wait a full another year regulatory cycle and wait until 2021 to implement these on properties. And so it is a potential, with your permission, that we would ask them to come back with regulations out of cycle in a May or June time frame, pending their discussions. So I wanted to throw that out to you and get any counsel that you have as we embark upon this process. And we certainly will pass that on to them, and they have an opportunity as well to listen to your comments today. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. That's all. That's it, huh?
That's it.
I was like, we have 20 minutes. All right, Commissioner Garcia.
So I guess my first concern is when you mentioned the possibility of fees for non-wildlife related activities, right after you told us that the purpose of these areas is for wildlife activities. I'm one that would be hesitant to want to start opening the door to non-wildlife activities just for the simple purpose of fee generation, because I can envision the problems that that's going to create. These are for wildlife activities, and I would hope we keep them for that. That's just my thought.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Garcia, and that's a great thought, and certainly appreciate you pointing that out. Our intent definitely is not to increase non-wildlife related activity on these state wildlife areas, but more along the lines of either curtailing it or charging for the use that does take place.
Commissioner Behill.
It's gotta work. Brett, I guess what I've seen in some areas, and I don't know if it's on state wildlife areas, there's a lot of squatters that take over these properties. And some of them are private properties. I haven't noticed any on state wildlife areas. But one of the items I think would be a concern is wildlife watching. They don't contribute to a state wildlife area. But is it a possibility to say you can enter here to watch wildlife or something like that with some period of time, but you have to buy a habitat stamp as a possibility. I know it's going to be volunteer because we cannot have somebody at the gate of every state wildlife area, but we may get some funds that way. I don't know, and I'm not sure it's completely legal, but that's my thought anyhow.
Thank you, Commissioner Vigil. And those are great thoughts, and those are some of the things that we're thinking about. And you may recall, those of you that have been here for a while, that we did go down the road of requiring a state habitat stamp to enter a state wildlife area, and we ran into some issues with that being perceived as program income from the federal government and impacting Pittman-Robertson dollars. But those are along the lines that we're thinking, and so we do need to have discussions with the Fish and Wildlife Service as we go down this road. And those are some of the things that we've got in mind is there a way to charge, of course, like you said, if people are going to go on there for non-hunting and angling related activities. And, that does two things by our thinking. Number one, it generate some income, from folks that aren't providing into the system for use of those properties. But number two, it may remove those properties from the lists of free access websites or free access camping websites. And in answer to your question there, Commissioner Vigil, that does happen a lot on private property in the state of Colorado. These folks that are nomadic can come and squat for a period of time. But it also happens significantly on state wildlife areas and increasingly so throughout the state.
Commissioner Schaefer. Oh,
Thank
sorry,
you.
and then Commissioner Blecka.
First, I just want to say I'm really supportive of this effort and exploring the options of how we can best prevent, I think, damage to an investment that we've made collectively. And secondly, we have run these issues about PRDJ diversion before, and it is something where I'd be interested in whether there's a need to have the AG's office to identify where the potential pitfalls are going to exist for legally within this process. I love the idea about the habitat stamp on state wildlife areas when we instituted it, whatever it was, 10, 12 years ago, before we ran into all those problems. If there's a way where we can, if it's the habitat stamp or if it's an additional stamp or pass of some type, that creates a vector for folks to invest into the system of wildlife habitat conservation. I think that's good across the board, but particularly when we're constantly talking about how to provide venues where non-consumptive users can invest in wildlife conservation. This is one of that laundry list of things where we have to explore those options. So applaud the effort and look forward to seeing what you all come up with.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Schaefer, and certainly we will engage the Attorney General's office and appreciate that suggestion.
Commissioner Blecka and then Commissioner Haskett.
All right, I'm really excited that we're actually talking about this because I see this as a much larger conversation around behavioral health, and this is just a component of it. And as land managers, we are part of this, I'll say, system that's happening right now. I've noticed in Jackson County, over the last few years, there was an increase in let's say, transient population, let's say long-term camping, but it really ties back to mental health and substance abuse and the behaviors associated with that. And what we're talking about in this particular context is the end game of that, where the functioning dysfunction is on our property, or where people go and commit suicide on our public lands, which happened quite a bit in North Park. And so I think, and I had actually reached out to Heather in last month to start this conversation because I didn't know who to talk to about this, so yay, that I think and it's not actually in our standard wheelhouse, but I feel like our agency has the opportunity to engage at the community level and see what's going on. In Ray, for example, we have a 2020 community development group. It's been in the works for like the last 8 years, but we're looking at behavioral health. And so the folks at the table are mental health professionals, the hospital, school counselors, social services, those kinds of folks. But I feel like we need to be at the table too because it's impacting our jobs, our land, our mission, that kind of stuff. And so if we could, I'm not saying we need to, be mental health professionals, but I feel like we should have more information. When we say, like, we remove these camps or whatever's happening, like, where are they going? We're referring them to resources. But are these resources at capacity? Are we just then bringing our problem to somebody else? And so I think it's a much larger conversation that I think is great that we're starting to engage in, and maybe, at the fee level. But I think there's room for us to look at it, I don't know, in another way. And I don't know what that is. So I'm just putting it out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Blecka. And we do often look at it from a perspective of how do we solve our problem, right? And so we very much appreciate that counsel to think a little bit down the road about how, not only can you help us solve our problem, but where we can refer these folks and how we can help them.
We need to get ahead of it somehow and be part of that conversation that's in the forefront and not just reacting to it. Because like right now it's like reactionary. And I feel like we could do better, maybe.
Just a follow-up question on that. When you spoke with Heather about it, do our officers have training? So, for example, if we were to institute, length of stay and fees and then have enforcement around that, would the individuals on our staff enforcing those new regulations have the training necessary to deal with something like this? Heather, hi.
Thank you. If I can certainly cede to Heather here, but I would say that, certainly our officers are trained in a law enforcement capacity, and part of that training includes at least a cursorial examination of, is this person potentially a mental health risk? And unfortunately, many of our officers do have significant interactions with folks in that boat, and we have worked together to take people into protective custody in that way. I don't know if Heather has anything to add.
Yeah, Heather Dugan, Assistant Director, Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Thank you. Brett is certainly correct in that we do have training that our officers go through, both in the original or the initial Law Enforcement Training Academy. That's a requirement for every peace officer. And then every year we talk about different ways to deal with individuals who are going through a mental health crisis. And as Commissioner Blecka and I were talking about this morning, we end up having interactions with people when they're at a crisis stage. So another thing that we could also do is reach out even more with our fellow law enforcement agencies, because it's a very complex problem that the entire community needs to be a part of. So I would welcome any ideas that you all might have that we can incorporate into our training, because I think it is something that's very important for us to participate in.
Oh, go ahead, Commissioner
Can I just
Blesa.
add one more thing. And also those people at the table, the mental health professionals, they really want more support. The government is very rarely at the table. It's always nonprofits and, people that have dedicated their lives in the weeds, and they need some more help. And I feel like we could help somehow. I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Haskett.
Thank you. I would have a concern over, like one of our state wildlife areas over the 4th of July, there was at least 14 or 15 people camped. They're non-designated campsites, heavy OHV use, and like Commissioner Schaefer said, what's that doing to our property? OHVs are heavy use and in and out and creating roads and things like that. I'd also like you to kind of look at that aspect of it. I know they pay us I don't know what you call the sticker fee, but they pay us for that, but how do those tie in together?
Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate that. The analogy that I often use is associated with the purposes of these properties. Or imagine if you went to a state park and you wanted to camp, but you couldn't because each camp was full of a hunting party. And imagine that hunting party didn't have to pay to use the property. And so imagine that then you went to hike down a trail, but you couldn't because somebody had set up a hunting blind and was hunting over that area. It's kind of purpose of property, right? And so while those are both activities that we love, we do plan those activities in different places.
Commissioner Adams.
Good morning. Thank you. So I was actually at a wildlife state area this past weekend outside Leadville. I went on a yurt trip. I snowshoed. I was using the space, but I did not have it's obviously not a park pass, but I do buy lottery tickets. So, I mean, again, there's the assumption that people aren't paying it all into it, and that's not necessarily the case. So it sounds to me, so when I saw this agenda item, I thought, oh, that's so interesting, because I was just there, and I think this is an issue, and I'm excited that we're having this conversation to come up, and it goes with that wildly ambitious goal, or I forget what WIG stands for, but around that financial sustainability and thinking about different ways. I would agree with both Commissioner Hassett, and I missed what Commissioner Schaefer said around those motorized vehicles. They were all over the place, and it was, the smell of gas was around. It actually was just very disconcerting to have, just as a snowshoer coming in, the impact was, you could see it everywhere. You could see the tracks everywhere, the noise, and so those are certainly things I think that we definitely need to address, as well as being more strategic about and creative around the funding challenges that we face. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Adams, and congratulations for snowshoeing in Leadville in winter and being back here to tell the tale.
Any other commissioner comments? Brett, is this what's the timing on bringing things back?
So we're looking at getting some recommendations from them back in time to hopefully come back to you for the May or June meeting. But that would also necessitate us coming back with final regulations at that point. And so this would be considered a very unorthodox issue stage. We considered bringing you an issue paper, but wanted to have a bit of a more robust discussion with you at this stage.
Okay, so are you looking for direction?
Other than just the general counsel, and if you have any concerns with us pursuing this, certainly let us know now. Otherwise, we'll intend to be back before you in May or June.
Okay, given that, Commissioner Schaefer.
Thank you. Just one note is, if we could get some examples of where these problems are occurring and sort of the types of problems, just to be able to piece together a mental map of where we're seeing the certain types of issues, and if that's happening in a certain type of area. Is it, exurban, sort of on the Front Range? Where are the issues that we're dealing with in rural state wildlife areas, to understand sort of that spectrum of what the officers are dealing with?
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful for me as well.
Okay.
Commissioner Adams.
And just a quick add-on there, I also love when we do the state comps. So is this an issue in Utah or, Wyoming or New Mexico? So obviously not a statewide, but, just for those western states, and maybe even tapping into the WAGA, or I forget.
WAFWA.
Thank you. I got very close there. Because they may have some resources already compiled, so you don't have to go and dig in the weeds. I hate duplicating efforts. So how do we leverage those relationships that we have with some of these other associations and organizations?
Will do, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it would be interesting to know what the different, if it's OHV, of course, is a very strong partner of ours, and I know they've done a lot with regard to enforcement and management. So if there's an area that we're seeing that we're missing out, we have a lot of off-road use or off-trail, stay the trail campaign. If we have a lot of infractions around that, it might be helpful for for our OHV partners to, put a little extra eye on some certain areas that we see that kind of use. So I think that might be helpful in a lot of ways.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Brett.
Thank you.
So before we go into the herd management plans and agenda item 28, we do have a public comment I'd like to take. Dan Gates, welcome. We missed you yesterday. Thank you, as always, for joining us.
Madam Chair, Director, Commissioners, appreciate the opportunity. I apologize for not being able to come yesterday. I was tied up in some other things, but one thing I wanted to bring up is, while trying to listen, and you're well aware that you had communication problems, while trying to listen, it was impossible to hear not only the commissioners, but public testimony as well. And one thing that's imperative is to be able to have the active engagement and involvement from the general public, no matter who that is to be able to have a consistent ability to listen into the meetings. And I would urge the commission in some way, shape, or form, given the fact that how much money is spent from the sportsman community that goes into OIT, to invest in some sort of audio-visual system for now and in the future, as the public input is only going to continue to increase, and the awareness of what we do from Colorado is only going to continue to increase. And I would hope that in the future that the general public didn't have to travel 300 miles across the state to just listen what was going on. But we are in a position at this point in time where advanced technologies should not be our dysfunction. When I watch a small town council have their ability to have communication and audio-visual communication with their constituents on a regular basis, I would think that an agency that has, a $230 million income should be able to come up with some sort of a system that would be transferable around the state, and also on top of that, at least take advantage of what is available to us, whether it's through, I know that you guys use YouTube and you use other means, but there's things that are available that we ought to be able to utilize to be able to get that message out and let people participate on a more readily basis. On another note, I did hear some of the conversation, but I heard it off a third party who was sitting here with a cell phone that was actually transmitting it, because that came out better than what was available through the system itself. I would like to commend the biologist of Colorado Parks and Wildlife. You know, there's 250 some odd biologists. And while some of that testimony that I heard yesterday was somewhat anecdotal, I would much prefer from a constituent in the state of Colorado and a sportsman to be able to take what the biologists of this agency do as opposed to somebody from Florida that has a panther anecdote or somebody from Minnesota that is talking about the backwaters of what bear and human interactions are. And while that is that person's personal experience, doesn't have squat to do with Colorado. We have a hell of a lot of conflict issues. We have a hell of a lot of human encroachment issues. We have a diversified landscape. We've got a diversified public. We've got a diversified set of wildlife. We've got 960 species of wildlife and 80 game species, multiple methods of take, seasons. We've got agriculture. We've got recreation. Some of those other states don't have those components to deal with. And to compare what other states have done with what Colorado is having to deal with, I think that's probably misleading. So I'd like to make sure that the commission understands that there's more to the equation, and I know that you do, than one person's testimony about what happened. And, you know, I know a guy that saw Sasquatch once. I'm not going to turn around and take his word for it. But there's places in Colorado that people say that there's Sasquatch all the time. So I would urge the commission to look in the technology aspect of it, and I would also urge that we are going to have a open dialogue and communication in reference to what's actually happening here and not so much what's happening in other states. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Dan. And I didn't realize that our audio was so off yesterday. I appreciate you not letting us know. And I do know last night at dinner there was conversation around this very topic. So I know that we've got some questions for you if you don't mind sticking around for a second.
No, that's fun.
Commissioner Hauser.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Gates. It is really timely. As I was sitting here yesterday, particularly, we're always reminded of how far people travel, including yourself, for these meetings, to be here to testify. Just putting my day job on the as an example here, the Colorado Mountain College, we have a number of remote locations. Obviously, in the mountain communities, we were approved by a bill last legislative session to be a remote testimony site for legislative committees. And so I sort of posed the question to Director Gibbs, Executive Director Gibbs, about whether or not there might be some opportunity for folks to go to, whether it's our remote site or another remote site, to be able to testify and be part of the conversation. So would be interested in asking Director Prenslow and others, Mr. Versteed and others, to at least explore whether or not remote testimony might be possible. I also understand from the dinner conversation last night that perhaps the biggest barrier to that could be OIT. And if what we've seen and what you experienced yesterday is any indication, I'd ask the commission to think about whether or not we formally want to request either an exemption or an opportunity to do a much better job, given how many staff and how many offices exist out across Colorado. This is unacceptable. If we want to actually be a technologically advanced organization for licensing and for anything that we do, camping reservations, we know that's coming up. It needs to be ease of use, and it needs to be customer friendly. It needs to be transparent. We need to be accessible on the broad spectrum, but also for those that can't travel to our meetings, we also need to be available. So this is probably a huge bucket to start wading into, and I'd like to ask that we start wading into it because I think we can do much better.
Commissioner Adams.
And on that note, it actually reminds me of what Justin presented yesterday as far as our budget, and I'm just curious how much of our budget has been allocated to address some of the communication issues that we've had. So I'm just curious if there, I mean, not at this moment, but, you know, I haven't even seen that budget, so I have no idea what's in it.
Director Prenslow.
Never too far ahead of Commissioner Hauser, but or Mr. Gates for that matter. But I did ask Assistant Director Versteeg yesterday and Lauren, who deals with, she is our direct person with DNR, and OIT, and so I don't want to put it all there, I'll just put it mostly there, and so it's not really just about a money issue, it is about coordination with that. We used to have our own IT and our own computers, and we had a much better system, but that's not what we have today. So we will look into this. We'll do more than look into this. It's more than frustrating to me also that we can sit here and not have people be able to listen in. You know, whether it's remote testimony, OIT won't even support our current video system that we built up to do those kind of things for internal, let alone external. So we will look into that. I don't want to give any time promises. I like to over deliver than under deliver. So we'll wait into it. It's a good comment, Mr. Gates and Commission.
Commissioner Haskett.
Thank you. I agree with what everybody said, but I also want to say it's not just here, it's also our offices, and I know on like leftover day and other times they have trouble, and if someone can't go to one of our offices and get the services that we're offering, that's not good either. So we need to look at that part also.
And just to clarify, that's due to a technology. Okay. Director
Same
Penslow.
issue, same place. Same issue, different place.
Fair enough. Okay. Mr. Gates, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the time. Appreciate it.
Okay. Back on track, herd management plans, agenda item 28, Julie Mao. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair, Commissioners, and Director Prenslow. My name is Julie Mao. I'm the terrestrial wildlife biologist for Area 8 in Glenwood Springs, and today I'll be presenting herd management plan revisions for 2 mule deer herds on the western slope. The first is D14, the Brush Creek herd. D14 is comprised of a single game management unit, GMU 44, which is located in Eagle County. This unit is 377 square miles in area and is almost 80% public land, which is shown on the map as green, yellow, and blue. Most of the private lands, shown in white, are at lower elevations on mule deer winter range. And conservation easements, shown in purple, protect almost 10% of the private lands in the unit. Vegetation types range from pinyon juniper and shrublands at the lowest elevations up to alpine habitat at the highest elevations. There is relatively little agricultural land in the unit today. Many of the historic ranch lands and native range on private lands have now been converted to housing developments. And notably, D14 is managed as a quality buck unit, meaning that it's managed for a high buck-doe ratio and that the unit has ample public land with very low hunting pressure and a high opportunity to harvest an older age class buck. Drawing a 3rd or 4th season buck license in this unit is often perceived as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The current herd management objectives for D14 were set in 1995, and at that time objectives were single numbers rather than ranges. The population objective, shown in the graph as the red line, was set at 7,000 deer. However, in the past 25 years of attempting to manage for this objective, the deer population, which is shown as the blue line, has always been well below the objective. Since 2008, it has been stable but low and averaging around 2,200 deer. And despite cutting back significantly on doe harvest for the past decade, especially since 2015, we have seen no population rebound. Lack of population growth is occurring also in spite of the mild winters that we've had in most years of the past decade. D14's sex ratio objective, shown again as the red line, was set in 1995 to 35 bucks per 100 does, with the intent to manage it as a high-quality buck unit. The observed buck-to-doe ratio, shown as the green line, increased after buck licenses became limited statewide in 1999, and then leveled out around the objective by the mid-2000s. However, after the severe winter of 2007-2008, D14 license quotas were reduced across the board, and the buck ratio has climbed well above objective since 2011. Social pressure to keep hunter crowding at a minimum has been a limiting factor in not restoring buck license quotas back up to pre-2008 levels. Because D14's third and fourth season buck licenses take over 14 years to draw, once buck hunters draw a tag, many of them would like to not encounter competition from other hunters. The fawn-doe ratio in D14 has declined from a high of 60 to 70 fawns per 100 does in the early 2000s, and has possibly stabilized within the last 10 years at a lower value around 50 fawns per 100 does. One of the key management issues for D14 is that the deer population, as we saw in the earlier slide, has been significantly below objective for decades. And despite our management efforts, the herd has not grown. Land development on private lands and year-round recreation activities on public lands have reduced both the quantity and quality of habitat. In effect, the ecological carrying capacity for mule deer has declined. Large-scale habitat improvement projects such as prescribed burns are becoming increasingly difficult to conduct, in part because residents are concerned about fire danger to houses and the visual impact on the landscape. As one of the few herds in Colorado that is managed for high-quality buck hunting opportunities, D14 licenses are highly in demand by a sector of the hunting public. But managing for a relatively high buck-doe ratio objective raises some challenges as well. First, keeping buck license quotas extremely limited has resulted in preference point creep. The minimum number of preference points needed to draw a buck license in D14 increases nearly every year, and as of the 2019 draw, it took 14 points for Colorado residents to draw a third season buck license, and 18 points for a fourth season buck license. And non-residents require 22 or more points. Secondly, although the prevalence of chronic wasting disease, or CWD, in D14 is currently unknown, managing for a high buck ratio sets up a situation that could favor the occurrence and spread of CWD within the herd. And this is because in other studied mule deer herds, bucks are twice as likely as does to have CWD. Finally, while many factors from habitat quality to predation to severe weather conditions can affect fawn-doe ratios, high buck-doe ratios in D14 appear to be correlated with reduced fawn-doe ratios. To evaluate options for new management objectives, we sent postcards to 2,700 D14 license applicants to ask them to fill out an online survey. We received 353 responses, which is a 13% response rate. A majority of respondents ranked obtaining a trophy buck as their most important reason for wanting to hunt deer in D14. Most respondents wanted to see an increase in the deer population and to maintain the current buck-doe ratio. We also solicited input from the general public through a public meeting that was held in Glenwood Springs and through the 30-day comment period, as well as from county commissioners, U.S. Forest Service, BLM, and the Habitat Partnership Program. CPW staff recommends establishing a new population objective range of 1,500 to 3,500 deer and a new sex ratio objective of 35 to 45 bucks per 100 does. To achieve these new objectives over the next 10 years, we will continue to set licenses annually, keeping in mind such issues as chronic wasting disease and achieving a balance between maintaining high-quality bucks and providing some additional opportunity for hunters to draw buck licenses in the high-demand seasons. We will also continue to work collaboratively with our partners in the federal land management agencies, private landowners, county governments, local municipalities, and NGOs to protect and enhance the remaining mule deer habitat. Some important habitat conservation methods include habitat treatments, conservation easements or land acquisitions, maintaining landscape connectivity and movement corridors, and adhering to seasonal recreation closures on winter range areas.
Thank you. I think we have questions and comments. Commissioner Garcia.
So just historically, just for curiosity, in 1995, there was a goal of 7,000, and 25 years later, we've got 2,000 deer. I got a pretty good idea, but you want to tell me real quick why we went from 7,000 to now a goal of somewhere maybe 1,500 or so?
So, can I display the population graph again, or? Yeah, I think in there. Okay, so yeah, so in 1995, when this unit was established, it was set at 7,000.
I don't know what the population was then, but
at that
Wild
time,
Guess tells me it was a lot more than what it is now.
Yeah, at that time, we modeled it at about 3,500. So I think, so before 95, this unit used to be combined with the next unit I'm going to talk about.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
So if we look at the next one, it's just south.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And so the objective, the combined objective for both of those, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's in the plan. But it was much higher than that. When they split these, they just kind of split the objective.
I thought, but I just wasn't. Yeah. When I looked at the maps, I'm not good at maps, but when I looked, I saw that they were stacked, and I didn't know that they were combined in 95.
Yeah.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
So would you like to continue on to the next herd management plan before we have discussion and comments then, or would?
Sure.
So are you finished with the Brush Creek HMP?
Yeah, unless anybody has specific questions about that herd.
Would it be more effective if we heard both HMPs before we add questions and comments?
Either way.
I mean, they're adjacent to one another, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can present the D53
Let's
one.
hold questions, comments until both are presented, and then we can have a more holistic discussion.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, so next is D53, the basalt mule deer herd. D53 is also a single game management unit, GMU 444, located in Eagle, Garfield, and Pitkin counties. And as pointed out, it's directly south of the previous DAU. So this unit is 371 square miles in area and is 65% public land. Most of the private lands are in the western one-third of the unit. where most of the mule deer winter range is located. And conservation easements, shown in the map as purple, protect 9% of the private land in the unit. And similarly, vegetation types range from sagebrush and pinyon juniper at the lowest elevations to alpine habitat at the highest elevations. And much of the historic ranch lands have now been converted to housing subdivisions or are slated for future development. In contrast to D14, D53 has been managed as an opportunity unit with the intent to offer sufficient buck and doe hunting opportunities to the public. The population objective for D53 was set in 1995 at 5,300 deer, which is the red line on the graph. The population grew in the early 2000s and reached about 6,600 deer by the mid-2000s, but then it declined after the hard winter of 2007, 2008, and it has not recovered since then. For the past 8 years, it has been generally stable but slightly below objective. Despite significant reductions in doe licenses in recent years, and despite multiple mild winters, the deer population has not grown, and the current population estimate is just under 4,500 deer. The fawn-doe ratio in D53 has been variable from year to year. In the recent 6 to 8 years, the fawn-doe ratio has been lower than the long-term average, but it has been increasing back into the mid-range of observed values for this herd. The key management issue for D53 is that the population is below the current objective and is not increasing. Much like elsewhere in the area, there has been direct loss of habitat quantity due to land development, as well as degradation of habitat quality due to landscape fragmentation and the growth of outdoor recreation activities of all types. Large-scale habitat improvement projects such as prescribed burns are difficult to achieve, often because of proximity to residential and commercial structures. However, the Lake Christine fire of 2018, which was a human-caused wildfire, burned almost 20 square miles, mostly on the Basalt State Wildlife Area and adjacent Forest Service land. Although this was obviously not a planned habitat project, we expect that it will effectively function as a large-scale habitat treatment of a portion of mule deer winter and summer range. To solicit public input, we sent postcards to 1,300 D53 license applicants, asking them to complete an online survey. We received 178 responses, which is a 14% response rate. A large majority of respondents said that their most important reasons for hunting deer in D53 were to spend time in nature and to spend time with family and friends, whereas obtaining a trophy buck ranked much lower. Most respondents wanted to see an increase in the deer population and to maintain the current buck ratio. We also held a public meeting and solicited input from county and federal governments and the local Habitat Partnership Program Committee. CPW staff recommends establishing a new population objective range of 4,000 to 6,000 deer and a new sex ratio objective of 32 to 40 bucks per 100 does. And to achieve these new objectives over the next 10 years, we will continue to set licenses annually, keeping in mind issues such as providing sufficient hunting opportunity for both buck and doe harvest and sustaining a stable, if not growing, deer herd. And we'll continue to work together with other agencies and private entities to protect and enhance the remaining mule deer habitat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And just got a note, I guess this live streaming is tough to hear, so if all the commissioners and speakers would remember to, get real up close and personal with the mic. Commissioner Schaefer.
Thank you. First, I wanted to say I appreciate what I consider to be fairly candid nature, particularly with the Brush Creek one, of not providing a range of alternatives, saying this is what we can do. I think that it is unfortunate. As I read through it, it was almost like a horror story of compounding factors and the death by 1,000 cuts of a mule deer population. And I think I'm not saying that there is anything that we can change of what has been done. There has been a large amount of habitat loss and fragmentation from whether it be housing development or unfettered recreation development. But I think that we need to look at this almost as a case study of what we don't want to have occurring on a widespread basis, and look at this as a lesson of we want to improve things in this DAU, but this is a lesson for if we don't be proactive, we're going to end up in this situation in many places in the state. So we continually hear about the conflict between recreation and wildlife, and we hear about habitat fragmentation and loss. At some point, we have to start making actual actionable items moving forward in order to not end up in this situation. So again, I appreciate what I consider to be a really factual sort of perspective on this is the state of affairs and this is what has caused it. To me, I thought it was rather eye-opening and much needed. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Schaefer. Commissioner Bray.
Yeah, thank you. I can echo Commissioner Schaefer's comments almost verbatim, but I thought both of these plans, your narrative was exceptionally well done, and congratulations for that. I see an improvement over these plans every time a new one comes up. As Luke mentioned, you really identified some issues we don't have a whole lot of control over as far as housing developments and that kind of thing, and the impact that they're having in these areas. I guess my takeaway was, and granted, I guess I'm beating my own horn a little bit, but as we lose traditional agriculture in these communities and the role that they historically played, for example, most livestock operations in these areas are relatively minor compared to what they were 20, 25 years ago, and their associated use with their public lands. Most livestock operations operated on the BLM and Forest Service lands and managed those in a certain way, and that was all beneficial to wildlife, whether you agree with public land grazing or not. As we lose traditional agriculture in these areas, it really has dramatic impact. And then coupled in particularly the Brush Creek example, there's not very much private land to begin with, and then what is virtually all development. So my take home is the loss of private property and traditional uses and development, those are our two biggest enemies in the state. And I think you're doing the best you can in those areas. And sadly, but I'll bet that deer herd continues to decline. But it's a well-written plan, and I congratulate you on that.
Well, and the impacts are not just on private land, but also public lands as well.
Yes, particularly the increased recreational influences year-round.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner Adams, then Commissioner Behill.
Thank you. I would agree. I really appreciated the executive summary, especially. I feel like I got everything I needed, and then to be able to dive more deeply with the rest of the narrative. So I appreciate that. Kind of dovetailing back to what we talked about yesterday with kind of revisiting how we are dealing with these herd management plans. I'm curious to hear from your perspective about the impacts that you mentioned to some of the other herds in this area.
Could you
like the elk and all the other ones?
Like other species.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, are we seeing this decline across the board, or is this, in relation to the other species in this unit? Are you seeing a spike, or is this a trend that is across the species?
Yes. So the elk herd that overlaps these two is E16, and that's a herd where we've seen it drop basically below the lower end of the current objective. So that's why we had to do drastic changes over the past year to cut back on licenses.
And I'm just wondering how we can tell that more complete story, as, Commissioner Bray mentioned the loss of private land, but it's not the loss of private land, it's the selling off of big chunks of private land to smaller landowners that, and more consolidated and condensed housing. And so, again, how are we as an agency collaborating with the Department of Housing, with the Department of Agriculture, et cetera, as we discussed yesterday? I just think that we just need to really be innovative and thought leaders in how we approach herd management and more comprehensively with the other demands and stressors that we're seeing, just in a more coordinated and purposeful way. So I appreciate your ability to speak to all of the species in that area, and and I hope that as these additional herd management plans come on board, there is an expectation that there is a component that speaks to the overarching landscape within that particular area, and any particular spikes or declines or et cetera that are happening, so that we can get a more global understanding of what's happening. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good point.
Thank you. Commissioner Vihil and then Commissioner Garcia.
A couple of comments. In the 7.5 years that I've been on the commission, I've seen a real big improvement in herd management plans, as Commissioner Bray mentioned. And I want to thank all of you biologists that do the plans and the management for condensing them in the way you do. They're excellent. Second comment is, it's kind of ironic that the Lake Christine fire hurt people, but it's a benefit to wildlife. Because in a couple of years, that's going to be a really nice area because of that fire. And it's sad that it does have that negative impact on humans, but it's positive for wildlife.
I think, yeah, your point is good, and it kind of highlights sort of the competition between people and wildlife for the same resource.
Yes.
Commissioner Garcia.
Yeah, I want to echo Commissioner Bray and Vihil. Thank you.
Commissioner
for all
Garcia, if
this
you could
work-
use your microphone.
All this work
Thank
on
you.
the herd management plans, and I would hope that we sit down. I think we're going to talk about being able to do even more in terms of us as a commission and getting together and working on these, and it may mean smaller groups and forming subcommittees. I think we've talked about that. I think it's extremely important that we do that. This is probably one of the most important, if not the most important part of what we've done over the last 2 days. So thank you. I did have a question. Basalt, I look, and in your presentation, not one mention of CWD, but then the neighbors, the Brush Creek, it's a serious concern.
I would say for all mule deer herds, CWD is something that we should be looking at. I just didn't mention it for D53 because of time limits. But similar to D14, we don't have much data on this herd, on the basalt herd as well. But with it being managed for a lower buck-doe ratio, in that sense, it's a little bit, it's not as highlighted as of a concern as when you're managing specifically for a high buck-doe ratio. So it still is a concern for sure. So thanks for bringing that up.
And I think that goes to Commissioner Vihil's concern expressed over the last couple of days that we do more work around CWD and identifying it as part of the work that we want to do, and I think increasing our work on herd management plans.
Commissioner Haskett.
Thank you. Thank you. Both of these were excellent. We are going to test for CWD in those 2 units this year. Is that correct?
My understanding is that, yeah, all of the units in the Northwest, and you guys can correct me if wrong, but I think all of the units in the Northwest that haven't undergone the mandatory testing of the past 2 years will be included next year.
Okay.
Including these 2 units.
Okay, I had a couple of comments as well, and I know we've said it 3 times, but I'm going to underscore it again. This is, it's the compounding factors, and this is very much a future look at what our state is, what's coming down the road in this state. We've got loss of habitat due to development, we have habitat fragmentation, we have recreation impacts, we have a lack of ability to apply our habitat management techniques. We have movement barriers. You didn't mention the I-70 and 82. As you know, before 95, it was roadkill city, and between 95 and, 15 years period, we put up massive wildlife fencing with no crossings. So the executive order about wildlife movement, corridors, and wildlife crossings are key as well. These areas, Commissioner Hauser knows this quite well, but for anyone who doesn't, if you put these 2 units together, you've got I-70, an absolute barrier with the wildlife fencing, and then Highway 82, another absolute barrier with the wildlife fencing. Fencing has been great for roadkill. We don't want to be losing our animals to roadkill, and we certainly don't want the impacts to people and vehicles. That's scary. But those animals need to move to be able to meet their diurnal needs and their seasonal needs. And if they can't get to where they need to go, the populations are going to decline. And to see us go from 7,000 or 4,000 down to 1,500 in such a short period of time, it's such a clear case for what we need to deal with. I think one of the things Director Gibbs mentioned yesterday was opportunities for more interaction with counties. I know that all of our staff that make comments on development proposals, I know that they do their best to mitigate some of these impacts, but mitigation only gets us so far. And you can mitigate 1, but when you have 1,000, the mitigation doesn't add up. So we as an agency don't have the tools to be able, we don't have the jurisdiction to be able to say, no, don't build a trail there, or no, don't build a house there. That said, if we have opportunities to work with Colorado counties, I think it's CCI, I can't remember the acronym. Inc. Thank you, that'll work. And I know all of our local staff are already doing everything and making sure that we have really strong connections to the counties, that the counties that do have the jurisdiction for development plans are implementing our CPW recommendations. But it's just another thing that I think we need to continue to maybe have a work session on, of what can we do given the tools, the limited tools we have in our toolbox, as well as networking. What can we do to make those tools stretch a little further to start to address some of these things in the areas we can. I'm not saying these 2 areas are a lost cause by any means, but I don't know, there's a whole lot we can do to bring our populations, as Commissioner Bray said, back up to the 4,000 or 7,000 range. I don't know there's much we can do here, but we can certainly take lessons from here where we go in the future. I'll get off my soapbox now, and we can move on. Do you need feedback from us? I think this is an information item. You'll be coming back to us with an action item in the future?
Yes.
Do you need any direction from us?
No.
Okay. Okay. Just making sure. Sometimes staff does, and sometimes. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Franklin. Brent, good to have you. Thanks for making the trip.
Good morning. Good morning, Madam Chair, Director Prenslow, Commissioners. My name's Brent Franklin. And the Area 17 terrestrial wildlife biologist out of Monte Vista, Colorado, in the San Luis Valley. Today, I'm here to present 2 draft herd management plans, pronghorn herd management plans extensions. To begin with, I have the Northern San Luis Valley Pronghorn Herd Data Analysis Unit, or DAU, PH14. PH14 comprises Game Management Units 68, 79, 82, 681, 682, and 791. The entire area is approximately 3,225 square miles, of which pronghorn range comprises only half of this, approximately 1,517 square miles. The DAU encompasses portions of Alamosa, Mineral, Rio Grande, and Saguache counties. The Continental Divide bounds the DAU on the northern and northwestern side, the Sangre de Cristi Mountains on the eastern side, and Highway 160 and Costilla-Alamosa County line on the southern side. Public land makes up approximately 64% of the entire DAU, and approximately 36% of the area within the DAU is privately owned. Of the public land, the Rio Grande National Forest manages 34%, the Bureau of Land Management manages 12.5%, the National Park Service 7%, the State of Colorado 4%, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services 4%. Land trusts, the Bureau of Reclamation, and counties manage the remaining area. A summary of the objectives that are being proposed for PH 14. The current population objective is 2,000 to 2,500 pronghorn, and the current sex ratio objective is 27 to 33 bucks per 100 does. CPW aims to maintain the current objectives, which would be managing towards the preferred population size of 2,000 to 2,500 pronghorn, and the preferred 3-year average sex ratio objective of 27 to 33 bucks per 100 does. The blue line on this graph depicts the PH 14 estimated population trend since 1989. CPW believes that this pronghorn herd was above 4,000 animals during the early 1990s. Since that time, the population has been on a downward trend to the current, or 2018, estimated size of approximately 1,400 animals. A sharp decline occurred in the mid-1990s. CPW believes the likely cause to have been drought conditions combined with high female harvest. CPW intended to reduce the population at that time due to high levels of private land conflict that occurred. The area experienced a severe drought in 2002, which may have exacerbated the decline further, contributing to poor fawn recruitment. In 2008, CPW set the population objective at 2,000 to 2,500 animals, aiming to maintain the population at that level. The observed number of fawns per 100 does during inventory flights since 1989 for PH 14. During the 1990s, fawn recruitment dropped significantly. As mentioned earlier, for the drop in population at that time, CPW believes the likely cause to have been drought conditions combined with high female harvest. Since then, the graph illustrates that fawn recruitment has varied annually. For the PH 14 Herd Management Plan public input process, CPW provided a draft of the Herd Management Plan online for 30 days to be reviewed by all stakeholders. CPW also heard directly from numerous hunters and private landowners. In addition, CPW received comment letters from the Bureau of Land Management, the Blanca and San Luis Valley Habitat Partnership Program committees, and the Rio Grande National Forest. The results from all combined input is the desire to maintain the current population and sex ratio objectives. That would be managing towards a population objective of 2,000 to 2,500 pronghorn and a 3-year average sex ratio objective of 27 to 33 bucks per 100 does. PH 14 management concerns and strategies to achieve the preferred objectives. Drought. Several slides have already demonstrated the sensitivity of pronghorn populations to drought. CPW will pursue opportunities to increase water availability during droughts and to maintain forage quantity and quality. Reduce license availability. The basis for harvest-based population management is to increase female harvest when a population exceeds the objective range, decrease female harvest when a population is below the objective range, and maintain female harvest when a population is within the objective range. As the population reaches the desired range, CPW will examine opportunities to stabilize it. All pronghorn hunts require preference points, thus any reduced opportunity may exacerbate that issue. Agricultural land. When the population was at higher levels, crop depredation was a significant problem, hence the reduction implemented in the 1990s. We expect minimal issues with a slightly increased population, and if they do occur, CPW will address these issues with existing tools. Private land development. Development in the San Luis Valley is slow. The threat from low-density residential development depends on the amount and distribution of private land and the area used for crop and cattle ranching. Furthermore, the exploration of energy development continues in this area. However, to date, no cost-effective gas, oil, or geothermal extraction techniques are available to justify commercial expansion. Proposals for solar power development also does continue in the area to increase. That ends the pronghorn herd PH 14. Please could I ask any questions at this stage?
Mr. Franklin, would you also like to, I think this is much like the former one where they're adjacent to each other. Do you want to go through both of them and then we'll do
Certainly,
questions?
Madam Chair. Mhm.
Is that okay,
We can do
Commissioner
that.
Vihel?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's fine.
I know you had a question. Thank you.
How do I get it to? It's not on there, right? I have it on the screen, but it's not up there. Ah, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Katie. Do you want to ask your question since we're waiting on the presentation?
yeah,
Commissioner Vihel.
If I can make a comment, both of these are really great herd management plans, and the thing about both of them is the restriction on growing that herd is weather and water. Them two are, and they're pretty much related. I mean, severe winters in the San Luis Valley get pretty nasty. So I think after you do the second one, I want to talk about potential for some retention ponds or something, that if we can work with our partners there.
Okay.
Because you can't have wildlife if you don't have water.
Sure.
And this is a desert in the San Luis Valley normally.
Certainly, Commissioner Field.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
All right, now I'll present the Southern San Luis Valley Pronghorn Herd, DAU PH 16. PH 16 is comprised of Game Management Units 80, 81, and 83. The entire area is approximately 3,351 square miles, of which Pronghorn Range comprises less than half of this, approximately 1,315 square miles. The DAU encompasses portions of Alamosa, Archuleta, Caneos, Costilla, Mineral, and Rio Grande counties. The Continental Divide bounds the DAU on the western side, the Sangre de Cristo and Culebra Mountains on the eastern side, Highway 160 and Costilla Alamosa County line on the northern side, and Colorado-New Mexico state line on the southern side. Public land makes up approximately 42% of the entire DAU, and approximately 58% of the area within the DAU is privately owned. Of the public land, the Rio Grande National Forest manages 26%, the Bureau of Land Management 11%, the state of Colorado 4%, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services 1%. Land trusts and the counties manage the remaining public land. A summary of the objectives of this herd are being proposed for PH 16. The current population objective is 1,000 to 1,500 pronghorn, and the current sex ratio objective is 27 to 33 bucks per 100 does. CPW aims to maintain the current objectives, which would be managing towards the preferred population size of 1,000 to 1,500 pronghorn and the preferred 3-year average sex ratio objective of 27 to 33 bucks per 100 does. On this graph, the blue line depicts the PH16 population trend since 1989. CPW believes that the pronghorn herd was above 1,200 animals during the 1990s. Since that time, after a 3-year sharp decline, the population model depicts relative stability with a gentle incline to the current 2018 estimated size of approximately 900 animals. Similar to the PH14 herd, CPW believes that the sharp decline in the 1990s was likely caused by drought conditions combined with high female harvest. CPW intended to reduce the population at that time due to the high levels of private land conflict that occurred. In 2008, CPW set the population objectives at 1,000 to 1,500 animals, aiming to increase the population slightly and maintain it at that level. The observed number of fawns per 100 does during inventory flights since 1989 for PH16. During the 1990s, fawn recruitment dropped significantly. As mentioned earlier, for the drop in the population at that time, CPW believes the likely cause to have been drought conditions combined with the high female harvest. During the late 2000s, fawn recruitment rose sharply. However, since the late 2000s, the graph illustrates that fawn recruitment has been relatively stable overall, with slight annual variation. Likewise, for PH14, for the PH16 herd management plan public input process, CPW provided a draft of the herd management plan online for 30 days to be reviewed by all stakeholders. CPW also heard directly from numerous hunters and private landowners. In addition, CPW received comment letters from the Bureau of Land Management, Blanca, and San Luis Valley Habitat Partnership Program committees, and the Rio Grande National Forest. The results from all combined input is the desire to maintain the current population and sex ratio objectives. That would be a population objective of 1,000 to 1,500 animals and a 3-year average sex ratio objective of 27 to 33 bucks per 100 does. PH16 management concerns and strategies to achieve the preferred objectives. Drought. Several slides have demonstrated the sensitivity of pronghorn populations to drought. CPW will pursue opportunities to increase water availability during drought conditions and to maintain forage quantity and quality. Reduced license availability. The basis for harvest-based population management, as mentioned earlier, is to increase female harvest when a population exceeds the objective range, decrease female harvest when a population is below the objective range, and to maintain female harvest when a population is within the objective range. As the population reaches the desired range, CPW will examine opportunities to stabilize it. All pronghorn hunts require preference points, thus any reduced opportunity may exacerbate that issue. Agricultural land, when this population was at higher levels, crop depredation was a significant problem. Hence the reduction implemented in the 1990s. We expect minimal issues with a slightly increased population, and CPW will address any issues as they occur with existing tools available. Private land development in the San Luis Valley, as mentioned again also earlier, is slow. The threat from low-density residential development depends on the amount and distribution of private land and the area used for crop and cattle ranching. Furthermore, exploration of energy development continues in this area. However, to date, no cost-effective gas, oil, or geothermal extraction techniques are available to justify commercial expansion. And also, proposals for solar power development continues to increase. That ends presentation for herd PH16.
Thank you, Brent.
Please,
Commissioner
could I ask-
Vigil.
Thank you, Brent. I spoke to you yesterday about the new state wildlife area in this DAU, the San Luis Hills. How many acres is that? Were you able to get that answer?
That, Commissioner Veal, is 17,000 acres.
So it's fairly good size.
It's a
and
big
it's along
size.
the Rio Grande River,
It
is
is.
that right?
There's 5 miles, 4.5 to 5 miles of the western boundary of that state wildlife area is along the Rio Grande River. And it was a partnership program between ourselves, the Rio Grande River, the Western Rivers Conservancy, Costilla County, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, and putting that together with CPW, GOCO funds, and LOR Foundation to put that program together for the public.
And just for the benefit of the newer commissioners, that land, a lot of that land was donated to us.
Correct.
And Costilla County is financing a lot of the fencing
Yes.
on that. So what a great deal for us.
It's
To have a
fantastic.
state
Mhm.
wildlife area like that.
Mhm.
Is there a possibility of water retention facilities on the western side of that? I mean, the eastern side of it, I'm sorry.
It is being investigated. There's nothing at this present moment, but it's something that we are investigating, especially now that you were mentioning earlier about water retention facilities that are occurring anywhere in the valley. The Forest Service has already put in some solar wells and rubber tanks, tire tanks, and then in certain areas. Now that's something that we already have a well that's being put in that can help retain water within that area for the establishment of wildlife propagation. Our biggest challenge at this present moment are the feral horses that we do have within population that is expanding considerably in that area. And the fencing that's going in, well, CPW is managing the fence construction and reduction in that feral horse population. However, you're quite correct. Costilla County has put in significant portions of funding. Mhm.
Commissioner Vehil.
So are we going to fence in those feral horses or fence them out?
This is wildlife-friendly fencing, Commissioner
Pardon?
Field. It's wildlife-friendly fencing, so we allow the wildlife to move through the fencing. However, it's to fence the horses out of the area
Out.
as much as possible.
And to make a point, those are not wild horses. They are horses that were abandoned,
That's
in my
correct.
opinion.
They considered feral horses at
When-
this stage. Mhm.
Yes. When the drought hit, like it did back in the 70s, was that the main one, when we had a drop-off of game? What were the years? Early 90s.
It may have contributed to that drop in the wildlife populations considerably, yeah.
You're
because
right. And what
reduction of
happens
forage.
then, hay prices go up, and people can't afford to buy the hay to feed their horses, so they just turn them loose. And they're unbranded horses, more than likely, and they do really well on their own in the wild. So their population explodes.
With the available forage that's there, but as that forage deteriorates, it'll put a lot more pressure on the wildlife as well as the horse population, but
Exactly.
it's not a designated wild horse population, as far as I'm aware. Mhm.
So if anybody wants to rescue some horses or adopt some horses,
Yeah, we've
there's
got
the
plenty for you. You know,
Thank you. Really good herd management plans. Like I said before, I've noticed a great improvement in them, not only in the plans themselves, but in the presentations.
Any other? Commissioner Adams.
Thank you. So I had a couple of things. I noticed that I'd be curious, and again, not for this particular plan, and I noticed that Mr. DeWitt will be speaking to us later today about bird herd management plans, but you know, the plan provides information about the human population growth in one area, and then the pronghorn in another area, and even you talk about some of these different land uses, and that was in percentages. And so I'd be curious to see an alignment across those data points within the same, data visualization to see, and I ask that because I think there's so much rich information in this plan. I wonder how we can present it in a way that can support multiple audiences in their understanding of this, because in my opinion, as Commissioner Garcia referenced earlier, this is we're in a crisis situation as it relates to these populations, and just in general, speaking again to Governor Polis's goals around, really addressing and being a thought leader around the climate crisis. And so I'm curious and wondering how we can really raise the public awareness around these issues, and try and take a broader stance against some of the human development that we're seeing. And so I think having those data visualizations that can then be used at the county commission meeting, at the city level as well, can really help to elevate this issue. And then even, I don't know if our communications division has been considering doing a public awareness campaign around the decline in these key herds and the implications of those declines, not only on outdoor recreation, but in our ability to live. And so I kind of have here, I was working on a little design around a habitat health index. And so I looked online, is there anything? Has anybody thought of this? Is there, I know somebody's thought of it. If I thought about it, somebody's thought about it. And so, but again, just a really, revisioning how we can, I work at American Institutes for Research, and we often talk about we are living in a time where we are inundated with too much data, and so it becomes overwhelming, and it's a number. So then, how do we revision how we compile this data in a way that can really be compelling to the decision makers and not only the decision makers on the legislature or on this commission, but the decision makers who are in the development side of the house, who is deciding to create these high-density developments in habitats that are already struggling, and how can we make a compelling case against money? And it's very hard to make a compelling case against money. Unfortunately, we know that you can't eat it. So again, I appreciate the information that you're bringing, and I'm just wondering how we all can work together to make sure that information, and data is just information, can really be compelling and persuasive to the decision, to the humans, essentially, that are making decisions that are impacting our habitat and our life. So thank you so much for your efforts.
The marketing, messaging, communication theme of the meeting, I love it. Thank you.
We're fortunate in the San Luis Valley. We just don't have the significant development at this stage in comparison with the Front Range.
Oh, it's coming.
To this,
Which is
it is on its way.
Which is great, but again, I think something like that, it's nice to show those differences, to say,
Yes.
okay, this looks like this looks like that. So, Commissioner Schaefer.
Thank you. At the HPB conference, we had I thought was a really interesting presentation from Mick Davis, talking about some of, or in particular, a fairly elaborate water project the HPP committee had put together down there. To me, what's really interesting is part of the water retention scheme isn't just for wildlife. It's also making certain that there's a way to be moving animals away from conflict and being able to, particularly off-center pivots and working with our ag producers. As we move forward and, with a slight sort of increase in reaching these objectives, you touched on it in the plan here. Is there any expectation of being able to keep a relative semblance of, I guess, positivity with our producers, or is this something that we're going to have to be certain to be investing more on those water projects in order to avoid those conflicts?
I feel that in the San Luis Valley that we're going to need to continually investigate additional opportunities of putting water retention structures, whether they be guzzlers, whether they be the solar wells, whether they be wet meadow construction. Like you mentioned, the biggest I'd say advantage to that is pulling those animals off of public land, off of private land back onto the public land. And at this stage of the game right now, the contention with private landowners has dramatically been reduced from what it had been in the past. However, as we start getting more and more conflicts, if they do occur, they'll be addressed on a individual basis as they occur. But yeah, we're not, with the numbers that we're proposing for the objectives, we're not expecting too much conflict to occur as long as we have these facilities, these water retention facilities for the animals on public land. Mm-hmm.
Great. So two quick things. I just wanted to make sure that, again, Commissioner McDaniel had sent comments, a few days prior to knowing that he was going to have to go in for surgery. His mention on these items was that he would support a larger herd objective based on habitat and historical herd size. I don't know, obviously, given the discussion about making sure that we reduce and manage private land and agricultural interactions, I'm not sure what his comments would be, but I just wanted to convey that.
Okay.
The other thing I wanted to let people know, I was reminded, what we typically do is we hear these plans, and then if there's no, glaring changes or controversy around it, we will put them on the consent agenda. So just remember to take a look on the consent agenda. Thank you, Brian, for answering my question on the last one of what happens next.
Okay.
What?
Brian. You called him Brian?
No, Brian sent me a note.
Okay, Brian.
After Julie spoke when I asked what the next steps were. So, sorry, nobody else knew that, but I saw
He
from
was
Brian.
hiding behind the podium.
Thanks, Brian. All
Thank
right.
you.
Well, thank you all sincerely.
I'd like to go ahead and take our break now. Jamin, are you okay if we take our break and then, okay, great, thank you. Let's be back at 11:30, I'm sorry, it is 10:35.